a mentor told me, and it was great advice. He said, one of the things that you could benefit by is remembering the notion of simpler is better, less is more.
Power to Live More with Joe Dodds.
Welcome to the Power to Live More podcast, all about productivity, organisation, well-being, energy and resilience. I'm Jo Dodds, and I started this show to enable interesting people to share their stories about how they use their power to live more, and by that I mean to do the stuff that they want to do more than the stuff that they need to or should do. It's about creating a life for yourself where you have the energy, health and space to be happy and fulfilled, spending your time as you'd like, whether that be at work, home or somewhere else entirely. That's your choice.
Hello, my name is Ellie Dodds and I'm co-presenter, and today Joe's interviewing David Nielson of DNA Worldwide. Joe first interviewed David on the Engage for Success podcast and then invited him to join us here. David is the founder and CEO of DNA Worldwide, a management consulting firm specialising in the execution of business strategy, implementation and large-scale change. David is a lifelong learner. He spent 18 years in the corporate world and another 33 years consulting to organisations and coaching executives. His book, The 9 Dimensions of Conscious Success, It's All About You, is a reflection of all that David learned on his life journey. Back to the studio.
Today I'm interviewing David Nielson of DNA Worldwide. Welcome, David. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be with you.
And this is one of the unusual interviews I do, in that we've already spoken on a different podcast, haven't we? You were on the Engage for Success podcast earlier in the year. So this, I hope I don't spend the whole interview saying, have I asked you this already? So start, David, by telling us who you are, what you do, and where you do it.
Well, thank you. I spent about 18 years in the corporate world. After graduating from college, I did a few things for a very short period of time, but then really decided I was raised with a decent work ethic and thought I have to get out and find a real job. And so pretty quickly I joined a company. My background was all in industrial psychology, undergraduate and graduate work in that field. And I spent about 18 years as a corporate world, starting out in sales. And then in 1985, I made a pretty significant life and career shift. And I went back to school, got a certificate in organization development. And I then was the director of organization development for a large consumer products company in the United States. And after 5 or 6 years doing that work and working with large culture change and sort of employee empowerment kinds of programs at that company, I jumped out, started my own consultancy, and I focused most heavily on organizational change and how to implement changes more successfully. After a number of years, really about 6 to 7 years ago, after doing that work, both as a managing director for a small boutique firm and then most of the time doing it on my own in my own business, I had some sort of an epiphany or an event in my life where I thought, I'm approaching the age of 60. Seemingly, I should have learned a lot, and when I began thinking about it, indeed, I figured out that maybe I had learned a lot. And I wanted to give something back in the form of helping people learn, and particularly younger people that were focused on finishing up their education or whatever they were doing and potentially entering the world of work. I thought I could give something back to that group. And so I got this crazy idea that I should write a book, never having written a book before. Did a little research and ultimately decided, yes, I can do this. And I recently published, a couple of years ago, the book, The 9 Dimensions of Conscious Success, It's All About You. And it really focused on applying things that I had learned, but also I interviewed quite a large number of people and integrated the data from those interviews into the book and came up again with those 9 dimensions. And since then, I've continued to consult to organizations in the area of organizational change and executive coaching. And I continue to do that. And now a lot of my focus is on trying to get the book out there and get the message out there, more importantly. So that's me.
Lovely. And where are you? Where are you based?
I'm in Evergreen, Colorado, which is a mountain town about 8,000 feet. By the way, it's lovely today, bright sunshine with a lot of snow on the ground. And I live here with my wife and 2 boxer dogs.
Lovely. I reckon, when we think about the States in terms of, or when I think about the States, I always think sort of internet marketers is sort of San Diego way sort of thing. But the amount of people that I've interviewed from your neck of the woods, I'm sure if I did some analysis, I think I've interviewed more people from Denver, Colorado, all around there than anybody on this podcast. So you must have a little entrepreneurial community over there.
I think it is. I think also because it's a wonderful state, a lot of mountain living, and also it's a I think very open-minded, broad-minded kind of state to the degree that we really have a lot of interesting people, and to your point, entrepreneurs who really focus on learning, and so I think it's an interesting place to live in addition to just being a wonderful place.
Yes, yeah, lovely. So let's talk a bit about the book. When we spoke before, we were talking very much about organisations and leaders in organisations, but I sort of think very much about the whole concept of leadership being, sort of ubiquitous. It's we're all leaders, regardless of whether we're, formally a leader in our organisation, or whether we work for ourselves, or whether we're parents, or whether we're, working in the community. And from what I remember from our discussion before, the book, applies across all of those sort of areas. It's not particularly corporate focused, is it? It's about leaders. Generally. Well, it's about yourself, isn't it?
Exactly right. And you touch on an important point, and that is that we're all leaders. I did a lot of work in the space around leadership and leadership development. I learned a lot of the leadership models going back 25 years. And the common thread that runs through an awful lot of them is that fundamentally leadership is about influence. And so anyone can influence. And so much of the training that I did on leadership really focused on the notion that if it's about influence, you can influence up, down, and right and left. You can influence anyone, whether you are technically a person with reporting relationships or direct reports. So yes, it's about influence and your ability to impact. And that's really where a lot of those 9 dimensions in the book, I guess I should probably mention them at this point. The 9 dimensions very simply are purpose, self-awareness, social awareness, authenticity, work ethic and personal responsibility, then listening, articulation, humor, and gratitude. And so I wrote the book to help people have greater impact tied to the success that they wanted to have in their life.
Yeah. So I've been frantically writing these these dimensions down. I think I've got them all. And do I remember that 3 of them are connected, or you've got a different level or something in there as well?
You're exactly right. Thank you for remembering. Well done. In the center of the model, almost like a bullseye, if you will, in the center of the model are 3 that we call the foundational dimensions of success. And they are the first 3 that I mentioned: purpose, self-awareness, and social awareness. And so, for example, starting right at the heart of the model is, are you clear about what you want to be? I love a quote that came, I believe, from Mark Twain, which he said the 2 most important days of your life are the day that you're born and the day you figure out why. And I have always loved that because for any of us trying to make our way through life, it's a longer journey and perhaps more frustrating if you don't know, what is it I'm trying to accomplish? So we spend a lot of time on that very foundational element before covering anything else. And then the others that link to the other six really are that notion of self-awareness and social awareness. So you're exactly right. The three first dimensions are foundational.
Lovely. So, question for you then is the Mark Twain quote about the day you were born and the day when you found out why. When was that for you?
Probably in about somewhere between 1988 and 1991, when I was going through a lot of changes in my life. I went through a divorce, which was a powerful change, not something I wanted, but probably in retrospect something that needed to happen. And it taught me a lot. I was promoted into a job that I probably was not totally qualified for, so it was an uphill climb for me. That was the point at which I went back and got a certificate in organization development, which started with very fundamental sort of introspective kinds of things, going through T groups and getting lots of feedback and really learning about myself. But in all of that process, as I raised my own self-awareness, I began to really emerge out of the other side of all of that, some of which was very difficult, being clear about, I think what I'm placed on the planet to do is influence others in a positive way and try and help individuals and corporations ensure that their best self is showing up.
How important is it for us all to know that, to know what our purpose is? And how do people find that? That you obviously went through some changes and I guess it sort of fairly naturally evolved from all of that happened at the time. Does everybody go through that, do you think?
Not necessarily. For some people, the path, I've often joked, people, particularly younger people that I've mentored over the years, have said, well, how did you come to do what you're doing? And, is it a career path or a path that I could follow? And, I've joked that I don't think you want to use my journey necessarily as the right model. It worked for me, but it is unique to me and it wouldn't work for everyone. And in particular, I would never encourage someone to say, yeah, what you really need to do is go through an emotionally drenching divorce that, will help you raise your self-awareness. If you can avoid pain in your life, I'm all for that, though pain is an effective teacher. But the two questions that you asked are, is it important that you find that out? And I think the answer is yes, and it's still a journey, because one of the things that I've spent a lot of time talking about lately, particularly to groups of younger people, is don't feel bad if at 25 your purpose isn't clear. And the biggest question I'm asked is, what if I establish my purpose at 25 or 30? Is it okay that it's going to change? Absolutely it is. Again, the focus should be on the journey. And I can look back at things that I may have done in my 20s, and I can then pinpoint, those contributed in significant ways to the ultimate purpose that I achieved. And so is it possible that someone would be very clear in their 20s or 30s about their real purpose in life? It's possible. It's just more difficult, I think. But I think it's important to continually ask that question and challenge yourself. As to how can you do it, my journey, as I said, worked for me, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But one of the things we did in the book is we talked about how can you write a personal purpose statement? How can you go through the process of finding out what your purpose should be? And so we walk you through several steps. At the end of the book, we provide the steps to create that personal purpose statement.
Mm. I do think self-awareness and that sort of self-development piece is so key, and I guess that's why that purpose from your 20s and maybe even 30s potentially does change, because, you know, until you've really done a lot to become aware of who you are, you're only ever making decisions based on a limited amount of information. So I suppose we should be expecting people to change their view of what their purpose is, mostly, rather than unusually, if people are very determined in their 20s as to what that is, because that must be more unusual than common for it to be so clear and not change, given self-awareness does make those changes.
I think that's exactly right. And, there's a certain element, it ties to the notion of gratitude and humor in my book, I think, is that in those early phases, if it's possible to avoid, big, really critical mistakes, great, that's good. But, the journey, part of the secret to really fulfillment or success in life is that the journey can be really fun. And, I have been able to, I start the book out with a story of when I was first learning how to water ski. I won't bore you with the story, but the basic story was about falling down a lot. And basically looking back on it, it was really quite comical. And I can look at it with a great deal of humor. And, it was fun. And so for younger people, maybe there's a bit of advice. Don't be too much in a hurry. Yes, focus on what you want in your life and how to achieve it and so forth, but enjoy the ride a little bit, I guess, is the point.
I remember you briefly sharing that story on the other podcast, and I don't think I mentioned at the time. It immediately keyed me back into a memory I have of my dad, who he died when I was 19. But I don't know, when I was probably 10, 11, 12, he decided to take up water skiing. I think he went once, and it was probably that moment in my life when I realised that my dad wasn't infallible, because I watched him exactly properly as you've described, like hunkered down in the water, the boat pulls him, goes to go, and instead of him like coming up gracefully, he just went flat on his face into the water, pulled over by the boat instead of up by the boat. And
right.
I think back, I think that's probably actually the first time I realised that he wasn't, brilliant at everything, which obviously, you think your parents are for most of your sort of young life, don't you? Yeah. So we talked a bit about humour again when we spoke before, and I really love the fact that it's in there as one of the dimensions, partly because a lot of what I do has sort of humour threaded into it in some way. But I was saying to you before we started recording that when I started my career in retail HR, I used to actually get sort of counselled quite often to sort of tone myself down because I can be quite flippant, and I can be quite sort of well, in fact, when I was young, they used to tell me off for giggling all the time, which was not doing my gravitas any good. And I still giggle now, and actually get complimented on it now. Maybe you're allowed to giggle when you're 50. I don't know. Discuss. What are your thoughts about the whole humour thing in terms of the dimension?
Well, number one, I look at things like that, many things like that, in terms of, are they useful? So the question, somebody, in some of my coaching or mentoring of people will say, well, I'm thinking about doing such and such, what do you think? And one of my opening questions is always, well, what's the utility, or how would it be useful to you? And so with humor, I look at the usefulness of humor. One, it can be fun. There's quite a large body of scientific research that talks about the endorphins that are released when people laugh and smile and so on and so forth, and that it's a very positive impact on the human body, on the human system. Secondly, it's a wonderful stress reliever. And so I think it is useful to the degree that I can look back, and the ability to laugh at myself and laugh at situations has helped me get through some very difficult ones. So I think it's useful and helpful in that regard. And to the point where, you were sort of coached to tamp it down a bit. here's the other thing that I believe. One of the other dimensions, the sixth, or the after the foundational three, the first dimension that I talk about is authenticity. And so to the degree that, you do enjoy humor, and you may find humor in things and giggle a bit and so on and so forth, that's a part of who you are. And so, people probably very quickly learn when they spend time around you that that's your authentic self. That's not in any way false. That's really who you are. And I think to the degree that you can have a sense of humor and see the humor in things as a part of who you are, that's true authenticity. I myself find humor in a lot of things, and I have, from time to time, I'm a bit irreverent. And, I have to be careful that it doesn't come off as offensive. But by the same token, I can look at situations in corporations and just say, wow, isn't that ironic? And so I think there's a close relationship between irreverence and irony, I guess. Anyway, I'm rambling, but the authentic part of you is humor. And so I say embrace it.
And there's quite a movement in corporate now for the whole sort of bring yourself or bring your whole self to work being important. How do you enable people to really be themselves and not sort of put all their sort of personality, in a bag at the door and sort of come in and fit the corporate model or pattern or whatever. It certainly feels for me, not in the corporate world, in half of my business, that people who work for themselves, some of the reason some of us do that is so that we don't have to conform. And so we do have the flexibility to be who we are. Do you think there's more personal development goes on not in corporate than in corporate? And I was going to say, if so, why? But, whatever your answer is, why?
Well, it's an excellent question. And if you think about the connection between an individual and their own self-awareness or their own frame of reference, who they are as a person, if you elevate that to the corporate level of that notion of frame of reference, what you have is culture. So all organizations, all corporations have a culture. And I talk a little bit in the book, in fact, about, what is your purpose and how do you want to show up in life, and use that as a tool as you look at companies you may want to go to work for. Do your own values, does the the basic purpose that you have, does it line up with the organization in which you may want to work? If the answer is no, I would never say, well, boy, you're just not going to make it in that company. I would say, I think you'll work really hard to fit in. And that may be a choice because you want to be there and so forth. But I don't think organizations, for many years, as I was growing up in business, I don't think people emphasized self-awareness. And by the way, even back then, there was research that said being highly self-aware was a contributing factor to executive success. It's kind of always been that way. But I don't think many corporate organizations emphasize that or encourage that. And so that was one of the things that was, if I show up to work and I'm going to be successful in this organization, I have to do it in a way that is acceptable to executives and to the culture. And I think what that results in is a lot of people being inauthentic to survive in a corporate world. And so I think more and more organizations, you and I have talked several times on this whole notion of engagement. If people are going to be truly engaged, and there are great benefits to employee engagement in its relationship to corporate performance, I think if people are going to be truly engaged, one of the starting points is they feel as though they are allowed to be themselves when they come to work. You're exactly right. You made a comment. People don't park their personal life at the door once they walk in.
No. Yeah. So how are you working with people now? So you said things have changed in the last few years. Obviously, you've written a book, and sort of the focus is about getting that out there. You've talked about working with young people. What do your days look like now?
I'm doing less work on the corporate level. I still have coaching clients, and I was doing a lot of individual coaching side by side with the organizational change work. I'm still doing a little bit of change work. I'm now doing it sort of in partnership with some other consultants that I'm mentoring. And so helping organizations implement large-scale change is still a part of what I do and some of the expertise that I have. However, I'm now, you mentioned, somebody that sort of works at home and is able to make a living doing that, and you're wonderfully successful in that regard. I'm doing more now that does not require jumping on an airplane. So I'm doing more of these interviews, podcasts. I'm still doing coaching, and I realize that I can do coaching, remotely in some cases. So I'm mentoring some people. I'm working in the background on large organizational change projects. But a lot of the work that I'm doing now is shifting toward, can I support the book that I wrote and make personal connections? Did that do a good job of answering that question?
It did. And it leads me to my next question, which is, it sounds like quite a varied schedule. And, we talked before we came on about the fact that I do corporate work still as well as work from home. And so, I know how complicated it can be at times to keep all those balls in the air. How are you doing that? How do you ensure that you get done what you need to get done?
Well, it sort of relates to some of the things that you're doing in your 5 fundamentals. Simplify and systemize are the first 2 fundamentals that you talk about. I really, years ago, a mentor told me, and it was great advice. He said, one of the things that you could benefit by is remembering the notion of simpler is better, less is more. And I think that I could go on and on for this, but let me make 2 or 3 key points. Number 1, the world in which we live is perhaps not allowing us as much to focus on focus, to be focused in what we're doing, etc. And what I'm fascinated by as I've studied and looked at it, I'm like you, somewhat of a self-learner, and I'm I'm naturally curious. I'm curious about people and their behavior. And so I read a huge amount and a wide variety of things. And I'm fascinated by this notion, and that is, with all of this technology that we have that's available to us, and by the way, I'm fascinated by it. I think it's great. I openly admit I don't spend any time on Facebook. I'm not very engaged in a lot of the social media, but I'm fascinated by it based on this point, and that is, with all of this increased technology to connect us, I believe we're becoming more disconnected. And the significance of that is that, there's fascination with the technology, and particularly, I think there's data that supports this, particularly with a lot of younger people. But if we are doing that at the expense of being able to connect as human beings, then I think we're losing something. So, number 1, in answer to your question, I try to stay very focused on what's most important. In simplifying things, if I have 12 things to do, and I'm a list maker, one of my favorite apps is AnyList. It's a great app for grocery lists or, to-dos or whatever. Anyway, my wife and I both use it a lot, and we can share it so we can share each other's lists, et cetera, et cetera. At any rate, I try to stay focused, and that's some of the consulting that I do with organizations as well. A lot of organizations fail to really achieve the strategic imperative they have, or fail to achieve the success they have, because they're distracted by too many things. So focus becomes critical. Simplifying is a real skill set. And then having those systems, systemizing your life so that you can, in fact, stay focused. And I always talk about keep the important stuff, the important stuff.
Yeah, I like that. I think as well, for me, it's a bit of a moving feast as well. I think it's about focusing on focusing, as in sort of constantly thinking about self-awareness, constantly thinking, is this working? Did I focus on what I should have focused on? What would have helped me to do that better? And sort of tweaking as you go. It's certainly something that I seem to be doing a lot of, albeit as I say on a regular basis on here, not changing my to-do list app anymore. I found one that is keeping me connected for it's been years now. I used to reorganize myself every so often when I felt like I wasn't achieving what I needed to achieve, and of course that was just a procrastination.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you as just a very quick sort of interesting sidelight story about simplifying and staying focused. A lot of it has to do with, I think, also, and this is key to establishing your purpose and being able to then drive to those things, investing time in those things that truly link to the purpose. I talk about, are you living your life on purpose? Are you living it deliberately, number one, and number two, are you living it on the purpose that you have set out for yourself? And I think that for all of us and for companies, frankly, there's a wonderful benefit in the notion of decluttering. And the very quick story I'll tell is that recently we have a pantry in our kitchen that we keep a lot of food in. And for a number of reasons, I decided I was home one day and had a fairly open day. And I thought I couldn't find something in the pantry. And I thought I've got to do something about this. I literally started pulling everything out of the pantry and placing it on the counter outside the pantry. And I did a couple of things. Number one is that I started looking at dates. There are date codes on most foods. And so I started looking at the dates. And my goodness, we had foods and jars and things that went back to 1999. And I thought, one, that's silly. And two, that can't be healthy. I'm not going to open this up and consume it. And they were things that had been gifts or we had bought things and never used them. Anyway, I dramatically removed the inventory or reduced the inventory in that pantry, probably by about 70%. I filled up 2 large garbage cans with out-of-date foods, and a couple of benefits. Number one, now we can be more focused on if we're going to eat something in the pantry, it's healthy, it's not out of date. Two is there was a great sense of cleansing for me to get rid of all that stuff. And now it's much more effective and easier to find things in the pantry. So that could be a parallel for, do we need to declutter our life from time to time?
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I've recently done that in my kitchen, and I'm doing that in my office as my next project as well. As you say, it's motivating. It allows you to see what you have got and to sort of just feel clearer and more focused.
Yes.
Excellent. So we've talked about you being a learner. Your bio says you're a lifelong learner. What sort of, I think you said you read. What other ways do you ensure that you keep learning?
Well, I do, in fact, use technology in that regard because it's efficient and I can get access to certain things fast. I have to limit certain applications because the sheer volume of information that's available out there is overwhelming. But I have 2, maybe sometimes 3 news outlets that I use or applications. And the benefit of those, and everybody knows this, but it's helpful to me because you can use news apps generally and you can filter what kind of news you want to see, things that you're interested in, and then they'll send you, the reminders or breaking news or whatever it is. So I do that. I like to stay up to date on what's happening in the world and also in my local in Colorado or Denver. So that's very helpful. There are a couple of others that I use. You and I talked about the fascination and the incredible value of Google. So I use Google a lot because I can so quickly transform a basic question that I have, or just something that struck me about, well, isn't that interesting? I wonder about whatever it might be. And you can so very quickly, you still have to do a fair bit of filtering from time to time, but so very quickly you can find out a lot and learn a lot. There's another, I find that too, one of my rules in life is you get what you give in life. And so to the degree that I'm out there with the book and I'm participating in podcasts and we're sending books out and joining certain websites and that kind of stuff, I get a lot of things that are articles and so forth. There are a couple of that I have used a lot, but partly because they tie to the book. Ladders is a great application and website, and they do a lot of articles, and I get some great articles on people and learning and those kinds of things, and so I read a lot of that. Ken Blanchard wrote the foreword to my book, and I've been a great admirer of Ken Blanchard, and his company is really great about sending out various articles. And the beauty of a lot of this stuff is people are not trying to make a buck necessarily; they're giving it back to the planet, which I think is so great. And so, Ladders, Ken Blanchard. There's some great stuff on emotional intelligence out there that I learned from. But again, it can be reading, or it can just be a quick Google on a question that I have, and right away I'm learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd second Ken Blanchard that I grew up in the corporate world reading all the 1 Minute Manager books.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I mentioned to you before we came on that I started my first part of my career working in a supermarket in the UK, and we did a lot of training around the 1 Minute Manager, including 1 Minute Manager meets the monkey. And it got so embedded in the culture that if somebody came, so I'm sure you've read it, but the bit about you've got all these monkeys on your back, and you go to somebody and you say, can you help me with this? And they go, yeah, leave it with me. And at that point, the monkey jumps off your back and jumps onto their back. And the premise of the book was, you don't want to take everyone's monkeys because it's, too much. So because it got embedded in the culture in a safe way, what used to happen is if somebody came up and said to you, oh, I'm really stuck with this, can you help? And instead of actually going, yeah, leave it with me, you'd start pretending to feed the monkey. Right. And say, you can keep it, but how can I help you to deal with it, sort of thing. And it was such a good sort of metaphor for the issue that we were having with people just sort of abdicating responsibility for things. That
there's a wonderful learning point there, and I think you're hitting on something critical, which is that incredibly important distinction. I'm willing to help you, and I'm not willing to have you let the monkey jump on my back. Mm-hmm. And the key thing is, the degree to which, and it's fundamental to behavior and reinforcement. To the degree that you're willing to take somebody else's monkey, leave it with me, that just enables the behavior for others that, oh, this is great. Whenever I have a problem, I go to Jo and she solves it for me. Mm-hmm. Which in the moment seems like, oh, what a wonderful thing that I'm doing to help that person. But in reality, what we're doing is we're enabling the wrong behavior, and we're not developing or helping the individual develop, particularly around their problem-solving skills.
No, exactly. And also, quite often we're not solving it for them. We're just getting more and more bogged down and buried amongst a load of tasks that we haven't got time to do. And so we don't actually do them. We just end up feeling terrible because, they're on a very long list of things that we need to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. So just before I ask you my last two questions, you mentioned that there's an assessment in the book around the dimensions. I guess that's a way of people working out what they need to focus on in terms of the dimensions. How does it work?
Yes, the website is davidenilson.com, and it's David E, and then I'll spell the last name, Nielson, davidenilson.com, and you can go online and you can take the assessment. We do charge, I think it's a nominal fee of about $25, but the assessment is quite extensive. We spent a lot of time and investment in making this a good assessment that not only raises your self-awareness around the 9 dimensions, but based on the score. So you answer a series of questions that have a 5-point scale. And then we've indexed that scale to a score of 1, 2, or 3 on that particular question. And you get a report within 48 hours. So if you go online, you complete the assessment, you get a report within 48 hours that gives you the scores and gives you the scores on those dimensions. And for each of so if you scored a 1, that means there's probably room for a lot of improvement. If you scored a 3 on a particular question or on the dimension, then that's probably something that you already feel as though you've got handled, you do it well. The lower scores, then, we provide very specific recommendations on how can you improve that particular area. And again, it starts, the fundamental point of it is it is a self-assessment, but I'm raising my own self-awareness on how I perform on these 9 dimensions. And then the second thing it allows you to do is we talk about how do you create an action plan that focuses on not trying to do 9 things or focus on 9 dimensions, but maybe what are the 2, 3 maximum things that you want to work on. And it allows you to narrow your focus on high impact kinds of actions that will help you improve.
Mm-hmm. Lovely, thank you. So last couple of questions then. Firstly, what about those days when it all goes horribly wrong, when things don't happen as you were expecting or whatever? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think it's human nature for a lot of people to get caught up in the frustration that occurs there. And there are any number of reactions that you can have that I would say are not useful. One of the reactions that wouldn't be useful is to blame yourself or get down on yourself. I think another, and we talk about this in the book, another reaction when things don't go well that is horribly destructive is to blame others. The short-term benefit of blaming is that in the first 60 seconds, maybe we feel better because we blamed somebody else and we don't have to take responsibility. The problem is you still don't have the desired result you were hoping for. And so that feeling of, oh, God, I feel so much better now that I blame someone else, that feeling is very short-lived. So the first thing that I think is most critical is, even if you're frustrated, is to have the awareness that this is frustrating to me. I'm going to acknowledge it and I'm going to own it. But the single most important question for me to ask right now is, first, what am I supposed to learn from this? Asking that question consciously, literally, out loud, however you want to do it, has the effect of sort of offloading the emotional reaction of either anger or frustration, and it shifts the whole focus on what am I going through right now. And so if I'm willing to take the time, now I'm talking about situations that aren't, crisis or emergencies, but in the moment, if I just stop and say, what am I supposed to learn from this? It allows me to calm down a bit. It allows me to focus on something that is going to be useful rather than non-useful. And it checks my frustration at that point. And if I do it well enough, I can then turn that learning into, well, number one, I don't want to repeat this experience. Number two, what am I going to do about it real time right now? Is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. It's funny, I was listening to a podcast this week and somebody was talking about things when they go wrong and the learning from them. And they described, they were interviewing somebody who'd had a terrible experience in her life and they called it a masterclass. And it was really funny because, well, not funny, but all the way through the podcast they kept referring to, the thing about a masterclass is, and of course it was, it was a way to describe, something that's happened that wasn't great, but, it's always a learning opportunity, which, sort of fits with what you've just said. So,
Yeah, it allows
Yeah,
you
I
to
think,
take something that's not pleasant and turn it into something that is of value.
yes, yeah, exactly. And so the last question that I ask everybody is, on those days where you get to live more, and that's where I talk about getting to do more of the things that you want to do and fewer of the things that you don't want to do, what does that day look like for you?
Well, tying to your, again, two of the fundamentals, simplifying and systemizing, to a little bit, actually, I'll give you an answer that may even incorporate all of your five fundamentals. One is for me to look at via the fact that I do lists, and part of it is just, again, a good tool for me to stay focused on what's important. Hugely rewarding to be able to cross things off the list and at the end of the day sort of take inventory. So when I have really had a chance to live more, I can look at my day potentially at the end of the day, but even at times during the day and say, one, am I on purpose? Am I accomplishing the things that I wanted to? Two, and I'm using the list to do that. Two is my wife and I often, will share things. One of the things that we have done frequently over the years, we don't do it every day, but because we both travel and we're not always together, but particularly on the weekends, we might say, we're having a glass of wine and we'll say, what were the greatest things that happened this week? And we just share information about the greatest things. And those might be just things that happened serendipitously, or they might be things that we accomplished. And so it's helpful to be able to do that and share with another person, why your week or your day was so great. I think the other thing that really ties to me living more is, and I've said this for many, many years after some epiphany years ago, which is, one of the most critical things in life, I think, for all of us is balance. Extremes, I think, are not very useful or helpful to people. And so one of the things that I'll look at in terms of living more is, okay, I got some things done and I was productive, but also, what did I do that contributed to my health in a positive way? Well, I had a really healthy meal. I walked, 2 miles or whatever it might have been. And also, what did I do that day that I found to be fun? And a guy years ago gave me a definition of things that you do for fun. They are things that don't have a prescribed outcome, or, as he used golf as an example. Actually, I used golf. He asked me, he was a guy that wrote several books on this notion of work-life balance and fun and this, that, and the other thing. And he asked me the question, well, so you play golf for fun? And I said, yeah, I find it to be fun. And he said, do you keep score? And I said, well, of course. Being an avid golfer, who would play golf without keeping score? And his argument, rightly or wrongly, and people could disagree with it, was, well, then that may not be fun because you're doing it with a specific purpose. A lot of things in life that you might do that are fun don't have a score at the end of it or a specific outcome. The very activity, the very practice of doing it is just fun and enjoyable, and you do it regardless of whether there's an outcome or not. So that notion of, yes, productivity, balance, and you talk about self-care, doing things that are going to be healthy for me. That's a great day for me at the end of the day that tells me I've really lived more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that concept of, as you say, just doing things just because you are. I mean, I'm actually thinking back to my late father-in-law and his golfing, how he used to say golfing was enjoyable, and yet there were times when he would not be happy having got to the end of a game.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, maybe that's part of it, that if you're trying to achieve something, maybe it has a different, if you don't achieve it, it has more of a negative than
I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about one thing that's a part of that balance in life too. You talk about self-care. What do I do to relax? Things like reading, hiking, My wife and I have an Airstream trailer, and we're newbies to Airstreaming, but I think traveling around in the Airstream is going to be fun. But we have 2 dogs.
Oh, yeah.
And the beautiful thing, and some people are dog people, some people are cat people. The beautiful thing about dogs is, number one, unconditional love. They don't care what kind of a day you're having. They love you just the same, and they're willing to demonstrate that love. And they're so joyful just watching them do things. There isn't a purpose or a result. It's just the ability to experience life with my dogs. And that's a great part of that, living more as well. Yes, absolutely. And as a fellow, I have a caravan. It's not as posh as your did you say it was an Airstream? Airstream, yes. Yes, yeah. My caravan's nowhere near as posh as yours, but as a fellow travelling holiday person, yes. I can buy into that. It's a lot of my podcasts in the summer and into the autumn have been recorded from a field in the middle of nowhere somewhere. Oh, absolutely. Well, there's a wonderful, you probably have it in the UK as well. I'm having a decal made for the back of our Airstream, and it's not an original thought. Somebody came up with it years ago, but I love the saying, all who wander are not lost. Yes. Love it. Lovely. Well, David, it's been great interviewing you again. Tell everyone how they can find out more about you and get in touch. Yes, the easiest way is that website, again, davidenielson.com. You can take the assessment online. For the book itself, you can buy it on Amazon. And there's a good bit about me at the end of the book. It gives you some of my bio, and there's a bit about me on the website as well. That's the best way. Brilliant. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
All this information is available in the show notes. If you go to powertolivemore.com / in this case 152, you'll find them there. And this week I just want to let you know about a series of blogs that I'm writing. I was trying to think what might be useful during the current situation, and I thought that a series of blogs about journaling might be useful. So I'm publishing a blog every day of April talking about journaling, why it's something that you might be interested in doing, how you can do it, what sort of things you can write about, why it might be useful to you, and so on. So if you're interested, please do go to powertolivemore.com and you'll find them listed there. And please do share it with other people if you think somebody might find it interesting, or they've been talking perhaps about making some notes, creating some diaries for the time that we're in currently, then please do send them to powertolivemore.com. And again, the show notes are at powertolivemore.com / 152, and we look forward to speaking to you next week.
Use your power to live more.